We want to talk about what we've learned in our combined 20 years looking at health through a gambling lens. Since 2010, we've been formally working in prisons, and what we've discovered continues to amaze and surprise us. While we once relied on prison referrals based on known rehabilitation needs, we now see that gambling is actually a vehicle used to perpetuate criminal behavior within the prison. We know that alcohol and drugs are commonly associated with crime, both for their ability to impair judgment and their addictive nature. Gambling had previously been seen as another element to include under the addictions umbrella. However, unlike alcohol and drugs, gambling can occur within a prison undetected. Oh well, that's right. So as you'll be aware, there's no urine test. There's no frisking that will prohibit it, and there are no clear-cut signs of intoxication of gambling. And it's so interactive. By its very nature, it requires two people, at least. So the need for status, competition, and excitement makes gambling even more attractive because it naturally creates winners and losers. So you've all got that status. Estimates from various prevalence studies, all published by people in this conference, indicate that we aren't in a position to shift our focus just yet. So letting you know that gambling addiction is still a concern, even though we're going to be starting to talk about other things. But internationally, we have stats that say approximately 2.3%. New Zealand-wide is approximately 2.1%. Affected others, 8%, and in prison, 21% that are identified as having severe gambling problems, but that might be extended by another 10% when considering less severe gambling problems. But I'm only telling you this because we had somebody, little birdie, say, oh no, you can't say that addiction isn't an issue, because it is still the core of our work. But what we've discovered is really fascinating. So we'll never stop being concerned because of the damage that gambling addiction causes. So rest assured that this will continue to stay on our radar, and it will continue to be our primary focus at the Problem Gambling Foundation. And obviously, because of those known impacts, relationship breakdown, domestic violence, child neglect, abuse, high rate of suicide, incarceration, bankruptcy. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Oh, you can do it again too. So the norm is to focus on the tip of the iceberg. So that's sort of the addictive part that we're referring to. So those with the worst symptoms are the ones that get the biggest focus because it's inconvenient and uneconomical to address the root of the problem. So it suits purveyors of gambling products to believe that only a tiny proportion of people are harmed by their products. Obviously, they rely on player losses to pay their shareholders. Governments and economic systems where gambling is legal tend to focus on the sharp end of the knife in order to contain health costs and to appease the corporate interests that dictate the economy. In the case of New Zealand, some essential medical services, such as helicopter airlift and ambulance services, rely on the proceeds of gambling in order to provide infrastructure. Oh. Charities. Right. Let me go by paper. No, we're on. I think we're still on the page before. So charities, can you go back?
Let's go back.
Mm-hmm.
See, I'm good at a lot of things, but not computers.
Okay, that's right.
I didn't notice.
Everyone has their superpowers. Charities are placed in the conflicted position of relying on gambling for their very existence. Declaring that right up front. Favorite discussion was back in the days where the Cancer Society relied on pokey funding. And we used to use the analogy that it would be like us selling discount cigarettes to raise money for problem gambling research and treatment. And also in courts and prisons. So if gambling isn't identified as a specific issue, specifically around the offending, then it isn't taken into account because there are too many other illegal needs. There are too many criminogenic factors that need to be addressed, and the link between gambling and offending is often less evident. So continuing on with the iceberg analogy, I like global warming, the rising water levels, we have frequently the tip of the iceberg is obscured. After years of awareness raising, we still experience barriers, as you'll all be familiar, to discovering gambling harm. In the community, we see families where poverty is multifactorial and is really just exacerbated by gambling, so it's not the primary focus. Or when gambling is a normal part of the culture, problems can be hard to detect. People tend to compare themselves favorably to their gambling peers. I do gamble quite a bit, but God, you should see John. I mean, he's obviously got a problem, and therefore negating our own problem. Church and community-based housing, raffles, tote tickets, so if it's part of our community, it can go in undetected. Owning horses and engagement in the racing lifestyle, again, it's really frequent that we'll have someone else that we know that's a lot worse than we are. Sport betting syndicates at work, it's incredibly normalized. So I'm just gonna do this because it'll make my life easier. There we go. So often gambling's a safe outlet for dealing with boredom, depression, or other less functional behaviors. So like escape gambling allows gamblers, so escape gamblers who will escape feelings of boredom and trauma and painful feelings will sometimes use gambling, which is slightly more functional than other behaviors they may have chosen. And frequently gambling is only part of a cluster of complex symptoms where gambling appears less urgent or pertinent to be addressed, especially if the individual is unwilling to address it or even to admit to it. So for example, in a sexual offenders unit, this may be seen as less important. Addictive gambling can also go unnoticed if there are only occasional isolated incidents or binges where more than discretionary income or discretionary money is gambled, but because it's infrequent or there are periods in between, and again, we go back to it's not as bad as that guy, again, it can go undetected. In court, if someone's being sentenced for anything other than gambling-related crimes, gambling's unlikely to emerge. Those on trial are unlikely to disclose gambling due to stigma and fear of further incrimination. Judges are unlikely to investigate the avenue as gambling is not viewed as a trigger for criminal recidivism in the way that alcohol and drugs are recognized as criminogenic factors. It's not that a prisoner will deliberately lie to conceal gambling. Often, prisoners view gambling as legal, so they don't recognize the extent of their gambling to their offending pathway. With education, prisoners very quickly assess themselves as having issues with gambling and risk-taking behaviors. So a quote was, "I gamble with my life every day." So the difference on the continuum is sometimes it's imperceptible. At the parole board, this is before prisoners are released back into the community, non-completion of programs or bad behavior is generally not attributed to gambling on the units, and prisoners are unlikely to admit this at that stage, especially if they're looking at getting let out. So, is that me? Yeah. So the second part is the real grit. And we're going to swap places, are we?
Can we get an extra 2 minutes for all this palaver? Okay, so kia ora everybody. As I said earlier, I'm Leanne White. I'm pretty much going to follow on from Laurie and talk about what's underneath the tip of the iceberg. I have to say I'm really excited about talking about the reality of prison and what actually happens within a prison setting and the gambling. But I am also really nervous because it's actually something that is really normal, but you don't talk about it. You just don't talk about it. So I feel like I'm breaking a bit of secrets here. So, okay. So in the beginning, our focus was to help individual prisoners who had been referred through the case managers. These people were referred through because a gambling addiction was identified as the main factor to their offending. We initially saw a theme of obtaining by deception charges, theft offending, although as our public health initiatives increased within that prison setting, we started to notice a significant increase in referrals. Now, you'd think that the pathway would be through the case management, be identified, and that they would be, because obviously we try to support to look for those indicators and through training, but actually most of our referrals were coming through from the prisoners themselves and being self-referred. You'd think, yeah, they just wanted to waste a bit of time, they want, have a bit of time out of their cells and come and listen to me go on about problem gambling. But actually, it really felt quite genuine that they really, after the presentations that we were delivering, they saw that actually this was a really big factor for them. So pretty much from that, so the offending was most certainly not just criminal. It wasn't just the fraud gambling that we were seeing. It was across the board. The very first group that I actually presented in the prison was a group of men who were predominantly methamphetamine possession or manufacturing. And I very quickly saw, it's a research project for you to do, very quickly learned that there was a real strong correlation between methamphetamine and the pokies. And yeah, so pretty much they could see that was something that they needed to address alongside their meth addiction. So it wasn't only just meth, we were seeing offences of sexual and violence offending also. So this increase is due to prisoners gaining an education and insight to the connections of their gambling and their criminal pathways. A high proportion of referrals are prisoners self-referring, and as they quickly recognise that they're seeking risk behaviours and that they're actually, as they would say to me, I'm gambling with my life and my family's lives. Quite powerful statements. Would you be able to? I'm just down to the, just go back a bit. No, back to the original. I just need that scrolled down. Okay, so as I said earlier, that we provide public health education programs, one-to-one and group interventions. They've all grown, and through that, my knowledge of the complexities of that gambling within that environment has also grown. And basically, I've become more attuned and knowledgeable around the harm of gambling for prisoners and their families, and ultimately the impact on our communities as a whole. I naively thought that we would be working with the issues from gambling in the community and preparing prisoners for the potential risk of gambling once they were released. This is still our primary focus within the women's prison, but not for the men. To understand why there is a difference for genders, let me take you through some of the discoveries of this complex male culture. But before I begin, I need to clarify that the content that I'm about to share has been gained through my observations of the culture. We need a researcher, a good one. to back up what I'm saying. And it's been through, hearing people's stories, the prisoners' staff awareness, talking to me about their concerns of gambling in the unit and the impacts on the unit community as a whole, and also the prisoners, and wanting to see some change. And I also wanted to, just before I started too, I feel I need to acknowledge the people who have been privileged to walk beside, that they've shared their personal journeys throughout their custodial sentences with me, and throughout this I'll use some of their stories and experiences that they've shared with me. And I feel like I've been in quite a privileged position, because it's, in that environment, it's not easy to be telling people what's actually going on in the now. So with that, confidentiality for individuals has been respected throughout what I'm about to say. I would like to acknowledge corrections staff, psychological services and prison management who have been open and willing to work with us to address this issue and take on board our observations and recommendations. And as I go along, you'll see how they're aware of the issue and been really proactive to work with us, which is awesome. So let's look under the water level to understand the complex drivers of the perpetuate gambling within the prison, and ultimately leading to recidivism. I'd like you to imagine yourself in an environment that has rules within rules, a world of expectations, a world where you have to do what you have to do in order to survive. A culture that demands you to maintain the rules, that you don't talk, you don't trust, you don't feel, so that you keep the secret. So firstly, to understand that within the units, there's actually a network of gambling and gang and criminal activity, and it's maintained by the prisoners by taking on certain roles. Corrections staff regulate the day-to-day function of the unit, while the gangs dictate the rules to maintain the culture that serves the needs and their cause. Unit jobs have been secured with the purpose to either gain information, collect debt, control contraband entering or leaving the units. For example of this, a certain role would be a kitchen worker. They have the power through their access to food, and food's very valuable within the custodial units. They get extra rations, giving them currency. Tractor drivers, being a courier to send messages or to deliver contraband around the units. Guardroom cleaners, they seek information. Information's power in prison. Information is valuable. This can be about other prisoners proceeding, some typo there, proceeding to intimidation, unit movements. They know exactly what's going on. They want to know what's happening within that unit to maintain the behaviour. And ultimately, also getting knowledge around the potential cell checks. They gather information, they gain intelligence of running the unit. And through this, one of the other factors too would be about establishing shops. Now, basically what happens within my understanding, and it is really me trying to put the pieces together and add it all up, and I suppose I've done my own little bit of research, and they have shops within units, and basically they establish the shops, and within the prison units, in order to sell and accumulate items, these are run by the lower status prisoners. So stock is used as currency. Examples of currency would be phone cards, food or contraband. Tables from Texas Hold'em and card games run by gangs, they play each other, representing their colours. To win the gambling warfare is to maintain status and respect. Prisoners who lose face and feel disempowered, driving the need to seek a sense of control and ultimately to regain their status. Are we? Okay. So basically, I had an example of a person that I was working with who was transferred into another unit, and he we're not even halfway through. He basically came to me with concerns around what that he was actually being invited to sit at a table, and each table represented a colour of a gang. And he was really conflicted on what he was going to do about this. And this is really common. The gangs actually, invite people in, befriend people, they allow people to win, and then they get this sense of, I'm good at it, I have status, I've got protection, I've got social connections, and before they know it, they're in a place of debt, and that's where the harm begins. And basically, through that process, they call it paying the rent. If they decline, then ultimately they could be ostracised from that community, and there's a potential of intimidation and violence. TAB accounts are established, and this is a common one that we hear about. They're usually managed by their families, so it's quite hard to monitor. Basically, they're run by their families. Debt interest is charged on a daily percentage, which can vary from prisoner to prisoner and dependent on their status when they get into the debt. Currency is a key to maintaining gambling. Everything in prison is valuable, as I said earlier. Basically, phone cards, contraband food, and individual skills. So someone might have a skill that they can be utilised for. So the consequences of this is what we're seeing for this perpetual cycle that is happening is the inability for people to engage in DTUs. And this is what I seem to be getting more and more involved with. Presently, I've got a man who was released into the community. He had been continually gambling throughout his numerous sentences, and he was referred to me after a week of release, and I never got to meet him until he was back in prison, because by the time he'd been released, he had spent an enormous amount of money at the casino, criminal activity alongside, and he's now back in prison on another charge. So we're now actually working with him, but ultimately from previous sentences, he had created debt, and the debt had followed him into the community, the pressure, the stress, and now he's back in, and of course he's back having to face his debt. So we've been very creative within that environment. Prison staff and case managers and myself have formulated a regime to help him to detox from the gambling and work towards entering into a DTU program where we can do some more robust interventions. We haven't got very much time, have we? Okay, so we've done consequences. So post-release, I've just talked about pretty much, they take their debt with them, they're disempowered, the crime could already be set. We see mental health issues, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, OCD, and traumatised. Do you want to go over to the next? That's not it. Do you want to go to the next one? So I'm going to get on to the recommendations. Okay, so basically our focus and our recommendations to corrections are education of corrections staff. There's one of me, there's lots of them. I'm hoping they'll get on board. Incorporate education into the essential programs, which we're already doing throughout nationally. In Christchurch, I can say we work with Ki Marama, the psychological services, and also Matapuna and the MERT program, and we work very closely with PGFNZ drug treatment units. And also pre-sentencing, to be more involved with the court process, so that maybe we can be, at the initial stages and get it on their sentence plans before they arrive. So we've also, other things we're thinking about, there's this real view of that we're up against. Some of the challenges of the belief is that this is just prison. It goes hand in hand. This is just what happens. And there's a real sense of hopelessness about making any change. Well, that's made me quite determined, actually, because something needs to change. And I think we've got quite a long way to go. but we can start implementing small things. And some of the things through conversations with people who have been in that setting have enlightened me and got me thinking that, actually, why do they need phone cards? Why can't, if they have phone cards, you take the currency away, they don't have anything then to be able to gamble with. No games with dice. I mean, there's been some changes in the DTU where they don't have any games with dice, there's no card policy. There is only allowed to be one person in one cell. And this has actually grown to be across all 3 prisons in Canterbury, which is great because it takes away the intimidation and the isolation within those cell settings. To review policies around currency. You enter into a unit and your weekly income's $2.80. You pay $2 for a TV and you've got 80 cents left. Doesn't buy a lot. So right from the beginning, you're having to survive. People who are running the shops are there waiting so you can get into debt. And as soon as you're actually, you could be just seeking to survive. Chocolate bars, it might take you 3 weeks to get a chocolate bar. So ultimately, you're already on this pathway of going into debt. So if everybody across the board, no matter what their resources or supports were, everybody had the same amount of money that they could spend and it was clearly monitored, then it takes away the power differentiation from someone who had $70 a week, which is actually what the maximum is that you can spend. So basically continue talking and educating, talking to parole boards around that potential risk when they're reintegrating back into the community. I've seen a consistent change with parole conditions that they're actually saying that they can't enter into class 4 venues and except for supermarkets, so this is becoming a standard condition. And basically pushing the exclusions, which we're doing quite regularly in there. Okay. So should we do the questions? I like questions.
Yeah, so for those of you who want to rush off to tea, feel free to do that. We are at tea time, but we had lunch so recently that I, for one, am still quite full. So if we can take a few questions, and people are willing to hang on for a few minutes into the afternoon tea, I think we can get you out ready for your next session. So.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, do you do the one-on-one inside?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You do group and...
Yeah. So we have an 8-week program, and we do one-to-one, like Matt and I was saying on the unit. He's not actually, he's in a high security unit, so I work with him one-to-one with all the other prison staff as well as the support system.
I agree. I think the staff, because we do some work in Napa prison, and it's all one-on-one. We spend a couple of days every week up there. The guards, the prison officers they allow it to happen in Napa. They just allow it to happen.
Yeah.
And so we need to educate, get some...
Yeah. Well, there's this belief around you take the gambling away, you're going to increase criminal activity, and they're going to have nothing to do, they're going to be bored. It's just, more work for them, and it keeps them quiet. It's a bit like with the smoking, when the prisons took out the smoking. It's actually prison policy that nationally through corrections that there's a no gambling policy. But it's not monitored, it's not policed. So.
And it's difficult to prove that there is actually gambling. They're playing cards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. This gentleman and then the question over there.
I know that there's cameras there, so I guess you just have to wonder how much monitoring of the filming that they actually undertake, because if it's happening, then it's happening on cameras and rec rooms, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And so obviously that's maybe an area that needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah.
Monitoring of what's actually going on.
And it is monitored, but it's difficult to monitor too.
Yeah.
And there's also the other part as well. Is I grapple on how to manage, or how to support someone or to change that environment. So I suppose what I do want to say is that corrections are open to our recommendations, and I'm sort of being creative on the ground to try and go against. I feel like I'm swimming up that way, and it's not against corrections. It's against a culture.
Sorry, I just missed that last bit. You were talking about exclusions in the supermarket. Could you?
Yeah. In their conditions, if people are identified, it's usually when I'm standing in the parole board, it usually gets put on there to say that people cannot enter into class 4 venues except for supermarkets. So they have to eat. So,
It sounds less about a self-exclusion and more about a condition that's part of the...
yeah, it's a parole condition. So we need to do some more work with parole around that, because... How do I? Well, that's why if they've got that, you can't monitor it. But with a self-exclusion, but they think that that's actually saying you need to self-exclude, because I've stood up and said this person's willing to self-exclude. So we need to sort of have some more conversations at a higher level, so that what they're putting as conditions is in line with the Gambling Act. Yeah. Okay.
Any more questions? Well, thank you all very much for coming to this very interesting session.